Hello, everyone.
Morning.
So welcome everyone to what promises to be a very rich weekend. I don't have much to say because I did virtually nothing. All the credit goes to Madalena. The idea, the planning, the invitations, the implementation. All I did was to apply to a university fund for some money, which we ended up giving back when the pandemic struck because we weren't going to have any expenses anymore. So it's bittersweet to have this on Zoom. Naturally, we would have loved to convene in Philadelphia, but it's also nice to see people all over the planet, literally, who wouldn't have been able to join us otherwise. So we'll make the best of the situation.
First speaker, Charles Sanft. Very, very happy to have you with us. You can mute yourself, share screen, all that you need to do. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Madalena. I'm delighted to be here and really honored and a little bit intimidated, to be honest. So yeah, we'll see. Let me share my screen here. It's funny. I spend a lot of time looking at Zoom lately. I feel zoomy, and it's awfully tiring. So I appreciate everyone coming here so early and listening to me talk about the Lunyu and its neighbors in the Han Northwest. When I started thinking about the topic for this conference and the Lunyu and its neighbors, I immediately thought, of course, of the Han Northwest, which is where I've been mostly looking lately. I think it's a place that doesn't get enough of attention, so I'm going to spend some time talking about background stuff. And if you know it, it perhaps is boring to you. And if it's not, it may still be boring to you, but at least it will be new and boring and not old and boring. And I wanted to think about neighbors in different contexts, right? Different senses of the word, which is to say neighbors, both physical neighbors and historical neighbors, intellectual history neighbors, human neighbors, and even documentary neighbors, quite literally documents that were next to each other, and as it happens, next to the Lunyu. I want to start by talking about the area that I'm discussing. There we go. Looking at the northwest border of the Han Empire, which is and particularly 4 border commanderies, which were set up, and actually talking only about 3 of the 4, but there were 4 border commanderies set up in this general area, the sort of northwest part of Gansu province and the far west part of Inner Mongolia, around the 1st century BC. And the period that I'm going to discuss is from the 1st century BC into roughly the early 2nd century BCE. And I'm sorry, just wanted to interrupt. Madalena, can you see the waiting room still? I'm getting messages popping up that
yes, I'm letting people in.
Okay,
yes.
I won't bother about letting them in then.
Yeah, speakers, don't worry about the waiting room. We're monitoring that.
Yeah, I'm used to it. When in my classes, I'm always juggling multiple things, and it's amazing how my students expect me to do 3 different things simultaneously. So thank you for not. Anyway, so this area, this northwest border region was, I mean, in historiography it is presented, I think, usually down to the present, the Han presence there as a sort of defensive action. I think it is reasonable to say it was at least equally aggressive action or expansionist action. Perhaps aggression's a loaded term there. And I want to start by talking about one of these sites, and I'll just talk about the 3 that are coming up. One of these is called Chantry Jinguan. Now this map here is we just saw Gansu province, and this map, I've circled the part that sort of matches up to this, although the cardinal directions are not lined up on these 2 different maps. Chantry Jinguan, this little circled area here. This was a control post in the border zone located in Jiuquan commandery. So one of these commanderies from the border region of the Han period. It was one of the area sort of central access points for this area, especially for people going north. It provided a degree of military protection for the routes going north. It was also an administrative center. Documents also passed through this structure. And I'm sorry, I forgot to set my stopwatch so I don't talk too long. Okay. It was excavated. It was one of the first early sites excavated in the early 20th century. The Sino-Swedish expedition, they dug a number of pits there in 1930. They're the ones who gave it its name. They recovered some 850 strips there, but it's actually in the 1970s when more documents were recovered there. This makes Genji Jinguan, at some level, part of the second wave of writing strips recovered from the region. Archaeologists recovered about over 11,000 writing strips from this particular site. As it happens, including a lot of different stuff, but also including some Lunyu. Okay, so that's one of the sites I want to talk about. Another site is called the Chantry. This is what I've been working on and off for a while now. It's particularly interesting, and it's getting more and more exciting. The Chantry, you can see it's located here, far to the west, and it is in between the area of what's now again called Guazhou and Dunhuang. It is on this westward route from Guazhou to Dunhuang, and as it happens, it was on that western route in the Han period. Also, it was a multi-use post located in Dunhuang Commandery. It had a border monitoring function. It was a military presence. It was also part of the postal system. A lot of documents passed through Chantry back and forth. Because of its sort of key position on that route, it was also a kind of hostel for official travelers and for postal travelers, and travelers with the right sort of authorization could even get chariots or carriages and horses, and of course, food from this. Those visitors, as it happened, included both Han Dynasty officials of various ranks, but also foreigners, people coming from the local areas, from groups like the Qiang, but also from further west, all the way into Central Asia. It's well known. Archaeologists discovered, if that's the right word, this site in the late 1980s, but didn't excavate it immediately. It was in the early 1990s that it was excavated. They found about 23,000 written strips with text still on them. There were more that were no longer preserved. As it happens, again, a lot of different sorts of bureaucratic material that I'm going to talk about, but we'll use there too. Finally, I want to talk about the smallest of the small sites, the Sanshi Watchtower, which is another among those that was excavated in the 1970s. It is a pretty small site. I haven't been able to locate a picture of it. We can see it's located, this is one that's located in the area of the Jina banner, right? So it's actually sort of on the border between Inner Mongolia and Gansu. This is the banner area here. This corresponds to this map here. And this green circle, roughly equivalent to the area covered by this map also. Again, the cardinal directions don't line up, so it's a little bit wonky that way. The thing is, this is a really small site. This is a small watchtower, although I could not find an image of it specifically. There are pictures around, I found on the internet, a couple of pictures of other watchtowers in the same area that give us an idea of the scope. It'd be a very small site, manned by maybe 4 to 6, a single squad of soldiers. You can see here the size of the watchtower. And as part of the document bureaucracy, there's also a lot of text discovered at this one, over 100 documents discovered from this particular site, the Zidong site, but also, of course, as it happens, a little something having to do with the Lunyu. This case in Dangye Commandery. So we have 3 of the 4 border commanderies represented by these sites. I've spent a little time talking about these sites and sort of discussing them for a particular reason, which is to say, what I'm going to show you about the Lunyu is about broader presence. It's not about a single site, and it's not about an exceptional site. It is about a group of sites, and these are just the 3 best examples I could find from 3 different border commanderies, so spread across this border region, all of which had the Lunyu present at them. Okay, so it's not just one site. It's not something that we can, I think, easily attribute, which in most cases would mean dismiss by pointing to a particular function of a site, but rather part of a broader phenomenon. And as it happens, I'm going to start with an example fragment from this 30景自动 site. In just a moment. It looks like this nowadays. This is I've not been able to find a better image. This is the publicly available image in the Juyan Xinjian volume. It has, however, been the transcription has been reviewed by a number of people. I think most recently and notably, at least for me, was Ma Yi and Zhang Rongqiang looked at it, but others have looked at the transcription too. So although we can't really read this unless you have stronger glasses than I do, there's not too much doubt about what this particular document says. And it provides, I think, a particularly, I don't know, can I say juicy? Is juicy the word for this? It might be juicy. It's a juicy example of the presence of the Analects in this area, in this teeny tiny watchtower out there in the middle of pretty much nowhere, manned by a tiny squad of soldiers, right? And we have this text that we don't really know much about. It could be an imperial proclamation of some sort. At any rate, it begins without partiality or partisanship. The kingly way is vast. Without partisanship or partiality, the kingly way, and there's some damage there, but we can fill that in based on parallel. I'll tell you just in a sec. Ordered. The Analects, quoted by title, which happens to be from 16/1, says, worry not about lack, worry about inequity. And then the text goes on from there. Now, it goes on to say the Sagely dynasty is supremely humane and pities, and it goes, and that's the continuation. It's a fragment, it breaks off, okay. It's possible that, maybe there is some question about where the quotation ends, but I've not been able to find any indication that the Sagely dynasty is supremely humane and pities could come from anything other than something else, right? It's not an alternate text. It's supposed to be part of the Analects. And here we want to pay attention to a few different things, right? That we have this border region, we have this post out in the middle of nowhere, and we have the Analects quoted by name and quoted with a text that matches pretty closely the text in the received version. The Analects is present, it's known, it's there. People in these, even in remote areas, are exposed to it and at least enough, familiar enough with the title to give it some sort of, I think, salience as a working notion. Okay. So that's one of these sites. I want to look at another document now, which happens to come from Chantry Jinguan. Chantry Jinguan is a really exciting site to work on for a lot of different reasons. Of course, archaeology is interesting and fascinating. That you can never get, or at least I can never get enough trash. And the trash of the Han Dynasty is one of the things that has been excavated from the Chantry Jinguan site. But documents, the documents from the Chantry Jinguan site are the first major set to be published in their entirety and to be published in really high quality images. So this is a freely available image, at least published and widespread. This text, which if you can read Han Dynasty script to some degree, you may already have noted that this is a passage from the Lunyu with some interesting characteristics in it. Okay, so what does heaven say? There's no label here, it just begins. It's a fragment, obviously, so broken off at the start and in what becomes the middle. What does heaven say? The four seasons move with it, and the myriad creatures come into being in it. And then that stops, that's this end here. And then we pick up again here. ... Years morning is already long, the gentleman three. And this is these are two very familiar quotes, of course, from the Lunyu from chapter 17/19. Now, in this particular case, we can look very closely at Chantry Jinguan and we can even know what the specific neighbors of this text were, because the way that the publications have been carried out are very clearly labeled, and there's over 1,000 other documents of every single sort excavated from the exact same pit as this piece of the Lunyu. I would note, therefore, that we're looking at something that was the neighbor, if we can say that, of all sorts of things, of all sorts of records, of reckonings, of edicts, of texts of various sorts. More importantly, from this side of the Lunyu itself, we have a text which I think gives us very interesting and exciting evidence for the existence of the Lunyu as a text proper at this point in time. Why? Because we have these two sections of the Lunyu, two quotations from the Lunyu, in the same sequence that they come to us in the received version. And that tells us, or at least suggests, I think pretty strongly, that we are looking at a text that was already circulating as a text and not circulating as a conglomeration of pieces, right? Widely known that the Lunyu was put together out of pieces that were circulating separately, and it seems to have happened in the Han Dynasty. Well, here we see some very, I think, strong evidence for the presence of that text. We see a text that's in good shape, if good is the right word. Not a lot of textual variation between this and the text as it comes to us today. Okay, so here we see that text in its in a context of bureaucratic neighbors. Let's look at a couple more. Now, the 宣传志 texts are, and I'm going to just put them up here in transcription. The 宣传 sites strips are presently being published. Okay, so whereas the Chantry Jinguan have already been published, and according to the publication, that's the complete set, everything that has writing, or even like almost could have writing on it, has been published from Chantry Jinguan. So we really have that complete picture. The plan, according to the publications, for the 宣传志 site is to do something quite similar and to publish every single thing. That takes time. The first volume of those publications came out last year, and I bet the second one has been delayed due to the coronavirus. There's supposed to be, I think, a total of 8 of them, so it's going to be a while. In cases like this, we're therefore forced to just look at transcription, but again, the paleographers working on those materials are the best, and I have no reason to give much doubt to what they say. And here we see another piece, not labeled Lunyu, but very recognizable. Zizhang said, if holding to virtue one is not great, then one will not be sincere in contact with the way. How could such a one properly have or properly lack? Now, I'm not married to this translation, kind of working. There are some textual variations here that make it a little bit tricky. And I was looking at Xingbing's sub-commentary, if that means anything to you. Others have read the parallel passage quite differently, or the near match passage quite differently. Yang Guojun, for example, does that. But for this is for the purpose of the discussion here, not so important. What we want to note is, again, we have this first piece, and then we have a second piece. A follower of Zixia asked Zizhang about relationships, and Zizhang said, and it goes on from there. We're dealing again with another fragment, but yet, as in the previous case, we see that the sequence of the text matches the sequence of the received version of the Lunyu. This is a strong indication of presence in the area. We can look at one more example. And this is a longer one, okay? This is another fragment, so it begins sort of, not even sort of, begins right in the middle of a text. Zhang, it is hard to practice humaneness with him. Zhengzi said, I heard from the master, and I won't read the whole thing, but that's 19.7. And then Zhengzi said, again, another piece from Zhengzi. Now, this also from 宣传志, this text, this strip, not yet published itself, but the transcriptions do seem to match quite closely the text of the Lunyu as it comes to us today. More importantly, I think, even than just the matching of the text, is the fact that we have 3 different verses in the same sequence that they come to us in the received version. This is, I think, even stronger evidence that we are dealing with a text that existed and was circulating in this remote region. Okay, it was far from the center in the Han period, just like it's far from the center nowadays. When we look at the kinds of texts that were discovered at 宣传志, as in the case of Genji Jinguan, we're talking about a wide variety of bureaucratic texts. And I want to take a second to look at those those bureaucratic neighbors, those neighbors that were in fact in situ, located close to the Lunyu at the time. Okay, so here we can go back and we can, this is just reminding us of the sort of clarity, the best examples here. These bureaucratic sites were filled with text of all sorts, right? These classic texts that we've seen, and there are some more of them, but these classic texts are a small part of this large set. Okay, there's a lot of text here, and everyone in those areas was acquainted with text. And I'm going to argue here that actually everyone in those areas was doing what I'm going to call interacting with text. That interaction necessarily includes, I propose, interaction with the Lunyu. Okay. Now, the kinds of text that we have from these sites include things like this, the standards for border zone signals. Now, I am cheating here. I've never let a fact stand in the way of a really good image, and here we have a really good image. This is actually from another site among the Genji Jinguan, not far from the three that I focused on. But what it really does is show us a marvelous picture of what these sorts of texts would have looked like at the time. The information they contained was the sort of codes that soldiers used when they were at these sites to communicate with each other at a distance. So it could be flags, could be fires and smoky fires, signal fires, torches, could be drums. There were specific detailed descriptions of what signals would reflect which situation. This is information that everyone had to know. Now it happens, of course, as I said, that this was from the Xinjiang. This is not from the sites that we're looking at, and I could not find a comparably complete example, but we definitely have this sort of text here. This is from a Genji Jinguan. If you see Xiongnu people outside the defensive line, raise 2 torches for the entire day. Now, this is one of the bureaucratic neighbors of the Lunyu at the time. This is important information for us here for a few different reasons. Texts like this contain information that all the soldiers had to know, okay? So when a person, conscript or professional, was located at a site such as the Watchtower we saw just a bit ago, they had to know the information that was contained in here. They had to have learned those signals. And we actually have reports on officers who went through from higher up, higher echelons to verify that the soldiers in fact knew the information. So this really did happen. This information would often be posted publicly. It would be hung on the wall. It would be read aloud. We know that. Soldiers had to learn the content. And I want to suggest that simply by being next to these neighbors, the Lunyu became part of this same complex. What do I mean? This complex of information, which was transmitted from text to person through a variety of means, depending on the person and, of course, the text. We have a lot of other sorts of text that were posted so that we can see that the content that the soldiers were exposed to and that they were supposed to understand was much broader than just these signals, right? So the vocabulary, the conceptual series that was available to them is not merely those documents. We see, for example, edicts. And if anyone's read Han Dynasty edicts, you know that Han Dynasty edicts often had very elaborate prefaces to them, even if their content was pretty straightforward. This one, this is about the beneficiaries of an act of clemency from the emperor, right, who forgave sins but didn't forgive them. And we're interested here because it commands that this document, right, be posted in obvious places in the districts, in the boroughs, in the markets and villages, and all of the officers and people were supposed to understand it. As it happens, this comes out of that same border region that we've been talking about. That tells us that this was posted and its content communicated to the people in the border regions, which is to say those same soldiers who were obliged to master the signals, the information which was also transmitted through text. We can go even further. One of the most noteworthy texts from the Xuanquan Zhi site is this edict, which somebody with spare time on his hands actually copied onto a plaster wall, and by good chance that plaster wall was preserved. Here we have another edict. In this case, the edict's preface is preserved. The content of the edict is fairly straightforward, but still conceptually quite surprising. I wrote an article about this a while back if anyone's interested. But this seems also to have been another one of these posted texts that everyone had to become familiar with. So what am I getting at here? Well, a lot of times when people talk about interaction with texts, such as the Lunyu, a question would be, who's dealing with them? That's a good question. Second question would be, who is literate enough to read them? And I'm going to propose that that question is too narrow, okay? That what we are seeing is a situation in which interaction with text was far broader than simply sitting down and reading. There are some different sort of shortcomings to the literacy-focused approach. Now, every approach has its shortcomings, including my own. So I'm not saying I'm perfect and someone else is not. And there's a lot to be said for focusing on literacy, but there are certain problems. One of the problems is that there is an implicit interest in the individual that is hidden in that focus that really doesn't reflect how people in antiquity, as far as we can tell, dealt with text. And that is the case in China as elsewhere. Reading aloud, creating, transmitting text. These were all group activities in antiquity. They weren't the province of a single individual at work with a single text in many cases. Something else is that focusing too much on the sort of single person model of the reader overlooks the fact that people generally didn't read silently in antiquity. We actually see reference in early Chinese text to the sound of reading, the sound of reading being the sound, of course, of reading aloud. And finally, as I was talking about these texts which existed and were posted, and the content of which was supposed to be mastered by soldiers in the region, right? Simply by posting those texts, reading them aloud and obliging soldiers and people to master their content, those bureaucratic structures were beginning to inculcate a familiarity with text. This tells us that people were probably learning how to read. It's interesting that we often treat reading as this weird sort of thing that's out there. Text is this unnatural thing that's out there. You really have to be squeezed into reading it, into learning how to read. Perhaps many of us, myself included, had to be squeezed into learning how to read. But actually, we know from literacy researchers that under circumstances, and I could talk about those if we wanted, but under particular circumstances, like text is important, the information in the text is important, there's someone who can answer questions for us. Under these circumstances, which were present in the border region, demonstrably, people will learn. This tells us, I'm going to propose that, we can imagine the first soldiers, and of course, modern soldiers, just an image, engaging in texts. And we can begin to imagine a situation in which the texts in which with which they were interacting, right? Not reading themselves necessarily, not only hearing, but probably hearing too. Most people probably hearing, reading some, and acquiring abilities to learn over time, right? Expanding their access to the neighbors of the bureaucratic texts, the neighbors of the bureaucratic texts being, including, as it happens, the Lunyu. So that based on the presence of the Lunyu and the existence of this system, I propose this scale of interaction that happened. I would propose that that everyone functionally at these sites was in fact interacting at some level with texts, including the Lunyu. But of course, for our purposes here today, we are most interested in that. The fact that this was a text that was promulgated officially by the Han government in the late Western Han period is probably part of why that specific text was there. But from the perspective maybe of a broader intellectual history, the interest is much broader than I think than just official promulgation might indicate. It was part of this body of textual information, this textual culture that circulated broadly and really managed to hit every level of society. So that's it for today. Thanks very much